I want to just start by thanking all of our witnesses today for appearing today to discuss controlling federal legacy IT costs and crafting 21st century IT management solutions. I also want to thank Ranking Member Paul and his staff for working with us on this hearing and for our continued partnership to address wasteful spending and government inefficiencies. Even though Ranking Member Paul is unable to join us this morning, I look forward to addressing the threats posed by the federal government's failure to maintain a modern and agile information technology infrastructure. Today is the first of multiple hearings on federal legacy IT systems. By shining a light on this important issue, I hope that agencies will work to reduce their reliance on costly legacy IT systems in partnership with Congress, the Biden administration, and industry stakeholders. Today's hearing will focus on identifying the costs and consequences of legacy IT, as well as the institutional barriers to modernization. According to the Office of Management and Budget and Government Accountability Office, in fiscal year 2020, the federal government spent nearly $90 billion on IT investments and operations. Based on analysis of agency expenditures, legacy IT maintenance costs accounted for 1/3, about $29 billion of that total spending. However, the actual cost is estimated to be much greater when we consider legacy IT's negative effects on security, delivery of services, and customer experience. To frame our discussion, we should have a common definition of legacy IT. The term legacy IT describes the federal government's use of old technology or custom systems designed to support insular agency operations. That is, legacy IT includes technology and systems that are no longer supported by industry vendors, as well as those that require additional maintenance or specialized knowledge to operate. We have seen the consequence of relying on legacy IT systems. For example, in 2014, hackers stole the personal information of more than 20 million people from the Office of Personnel Management because they were able to breach OPM's vulnerable legacy IT systems that lacked encryption. Despite this breach that was clearly linked to a failure to modernize, OPM still relies on a 34-year-old legacy IT system that costs $45 million annually, roughly 1/3 of OPM's annual IT budget, even though a modern system would only cost $10 million and produce $16 million in cost savings. At the Internal Revenue Service, the system used to annually process millions of tax documents is more than 50 years old and relies on a programming language called the Common Business-Oriented Language, or COBOL, which was invented in 1959. In 2018, implementation of the 2017 tax law hit a major roadblock due to a shortage of staff with the specialized knowledge needed to update COBOL-based tax processing systems. IRS estimates that it costs $15.9 million annually to operate this system, and 60% of those costs are for labor alone. During the COVID-19 pandemic, IRS faced additional challenges because many of its aging systems rely on paper rather than digital records, paper that was inaccessible to IRS employees who were working remotely. And as a result, the American people felt the burden of delayed tax returns and economic stimulus payments. Similarly, in 2016, the Social Security Administration was forced to rehire retirees to maintain the COBOL system used for making payments to beneficiaries and their dependents. These systems cost the Social Security Administration about $146 million annually to operate. However, the Social Security Administration estimates that it would only cost $25 million over 5 years to modernize the system, and that would significantly improve functionality and security, as well as eliminate the need for specialized programmers. This begs the question, what are agencies waiting for? What's holding them back from realizing significant cost savings, increasing security, and providing greater customer service delivery through reducing their reliance on legacy IT? In addition to the costs and consequences of relying on legacy IT systems, today's hearing will also discuss the institutional barriers that prevent agencies from moving forward with their modernization efforts. Our distinguished panel includes the Director of the Government Accountability's Office Information Technology and Cybersecurity team, as well as 3 former federal agency chief information officers who navigated the challenging IT modernization landscape and successfully moved their agencies away from legacy IT systems. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses about how they achieve success by leveraging available resources and by being innovative. I'd like to start by identifying the costs and consequences of relying on legacy IT. We've established what we mean by legacy IT, namely systems no longer supported by industry vendors or custom systems that are difficult to manage and adapt over time. However, what is more difficult to define are the costs, both quantitative and qualitative, that continued reliance on legacy IT produces. Mr. Walsh, how does GAO determine costs associated with legacy systems, and how can agencies improve their identification and reporting of these costs?
Identifying costs associated with legacy systems is more difficult than one might think. As Mr. Everett noted, the fax machines don't show up on a spreadsheet. They're hard to figure out. You can look at our inventory of IT systems, but we just finished getting a complete inventory of our software licenses for each of the major CFO Act agencies this past year. So we still need to work on getting better inventories of what IT we have out there before we can fully capture the cost. There is a nascent effort underway called Technology Business Management, TBM, which would closely tie accounting systems to our IT oversight and management systems, which would help allow us to better track where the money is going. But to answer your question, there is no good way right now to identify all of the legacy IT in government.
I want to follow up with that because, as I mentioned in my opening statement, roughly 1/3 of total federal spending on IT went toward legacy systems in 2020. But many experts believe that that number doesn't capture the whole picture. So, Mr. Walsh, what are we leaving out of our calculations on legacy IT costs? How can we better factor in qualitative or performance costs associated with legacy IT systems?
So one of the biggest issues with the dollar amount is the $90 billion that this is all predicated upon is dramatically understated. That $90 billion does not include weapons systems or satellites or supercomputers. There's a lot of IT in the government that one might think, hey, that's certainly IT, that actually is not included in that number. So getting all of that IT accounted for is the first big step. Once it is accounted for, having that accounting system tie in to our technology management would help us get better to see if the money is going for specific hardware or software usages. But this is not a silver bullet, easy fix. This is going to take time.
Well, thank you, and I will follow up with you on that probably in another round of questions. But let me move on to Ms. Coleman right now. The American people pay the price of failing to modernize legacy IT systems. The United States government ranks among the lowest industries in customer satisfaction. Over the past year in particular, my office has received hundreds of messages from constituents struggling to access passports and visas, unemployment benefits, economic stimulus payments, benefits information from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and information on filing taxes. We've also heard from federal employees like those at the National Passport Center in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who want to respond to the needs of the American people but simply can't do it because of their limited IT capabilities. Much of this is due to the antiquated paper-based systems that cannot support 21st century agency missions or respond to changing requirements during a pandemic. Ms. Coleman, how important is it for agencies to recognize that failing to modernize means failing to serve the American people?
Thank you, Chair Hassan. I think it's a vital issue because, as you point out, we interact with the government on really critical services that we count on, and if those services aren't delivered effectively, there's a cost. There's a cost in terms of employee productivity and in terms of our time as citizens and as the public. And there's also a public trust at stake. There's a a confidence in the ability of government to deliver what we are anticipating as taxpayers and as citizens. So I think that public trust is one of the key costs. And I think that it starts from the way government has been designed and operated. Our systems reflect the way the government is set up, sort of from the inside out, with the programs designed around different siloed functions. And as we interact with government, we don't think that way, but we're forced to navigate the complexity of that bureaucracy. So I think one criteria to change this is to start to think from the outside in, from the point of view of the customer or the resident that's navigating that process. And there are very encouraging success stories. For example, U.S. Department of Agriculture has created farmers.gov, which is a portal for all services delivered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So you don't have to navigate separate programs for crop loans or disaster insurance or conservation research. All of these things have been integrated and delivered in a holistic way. It offers an example for others to be mindful of.
Thank you. Let me just follow up. Mr. Walsh, can you describe agency efforts to prioritize customer experience through IT modernization? Ms. Coleman just mentioned one at the Department of Agriculture, but I think the Department of Education also comes to mind as a leader that's used IT modernization to improve customer service and mission readiness.
That is correct. The Department of Education has actually modernized all of its data centers. It is now almost entirely in the cloud, and to its credit, it is moving to get away from legacy. That's not to say their modernization journey is done, but they are a leader in that area.
Thank you. I'm going to, I think, get through one more question. Some have argued, Mr. Walsh, that maintaining legacy systems, especially customer-built systems that rely on antiquated coding languages and lack connectivity to other agency systems, are insulated from cyber threats and do not need to be modernized because they pose little risk. So, Mr. Walsh, do you agree with this argument? And if not, what would be a better risk management strategy than simply maintaining legacy IT systems in perpetuity?
So, legacy systems represent a security risk. They are not good at meeting our mission needs. They cost more to maintain because a lot of times the people who can maintain them are retired or in some cases deceased, and they increase our cost every year. I don't think that security through obscurity or just hoping that the bad guys don't know the system code is a good approach.
Well, thank you. And Ms. Wynn and Mr. Everett, the agencies you've worked for both handle extremely sensitive information that may be stored on legacy systems. How did you balance the need for modernizing legacy IT systems with mitigating risks inherent to storing sensitive information? And why don't we start with you, Mr. Everett, and then quickly on to Ms. Coleman.
Well, I'll quickly say that that was an enormous challenge for us. As Kevin already said, one of the issues you have with legacy systems is you can't put modern protections on. Multi-factor authentication, encryption. Those systems, the secret of those systems is to even work today, they often have to have a number of these little enabling things we call system accounts or administrative accounts, right? When you administrative account, you know that's exactly what a bad guy wants to use because once they have it, they can use it to access and do other things in your system. And so that's one of the dirty secrets of those older legacy things. They're not protected more because people don't know them. They're in fact enabled by a bunch of other things, and pretty soon it's a Rube Goldberg apparatus. And also, you know, and security is also about resilience, right? One of the reasons your constituents can't get on those is they fail all the time. Well, why? Because they're old and they fall apart and nobody knows how to fix them. And so that in and itself is a security risk because everything else in the system has to adapt around that, which causes you to make all sorts of other security compromises to keep it going. So,
thank you. And Ms. Coleman, just very quickly on that issue, and then we're going to move to other senators.
Thank you. The point is well taken, and one of the key issues with securing data of any kind of sensitivity is good cyber hygiene. And estimates are that well over 50% of all vulnerabilities are due to just basic good cyber hygiene. And with modern cloud platforms, you're really taking advantage of best-in-class security and a partner who can assist you with that. But really, ultimately, the government needs to start with basics and maintain good protocols for such.
I'll turn to a second round of questions, and I appreciate the testimony you all have provided so far. I'm going to start with this question to Ms. Wynn. I've advocated for a biennial budgeting cycle where Congress would determine and appropriate the budget in 1 year, and then year 2 can be spent on doing effective oversight to inform future spending. The current 1 year cycle often leads to hasty decision-making and neglects capital investments that take several years to implement, including IT modernization projects designed to move away from legacy IT systems. Ms. Nguyen, how difficult is it to manage IT modernization around the 1 year budgeting and appropriation cycle, and how did you work within this cycle to achieve your goals? What would you have done differently if there was a biennial budgeting process?
Thank you for the Chair Hassan for the question. One of the things that I found first is sort of the annual appropriation, and that is the first thing you need to know is every time you cross a fiscal year with a project, and most IT projects cross a fiscal year, you add more risk to your plan. And that is because from year to year, you face the potential loss of funding or the loss of people. So now you've disrupted your project, and now you've most likely extended when you're going to get that project done. That extension, if it goes on too long, means you're potentially using software that will no longer be considered modern or available or could reach end of life by the time you use or get that system back in operation after it's been modernized. What I would do is, probably as most CIOs would do, is I'd take my total budget and I create a reserve. And that way, that reserve would be used to make sure that the most critical or the highest risk projects would get funding for sure going into the secondary years of their project. And that way, I knew that they could be able to continue. And if I didn't do that, I'd run the risk of work stoppage. And then I could lose the talent of my staff, of staff from other mission areas or mission support, or I could even lose contractor staff. And that would, again, start to slow down and add more risk to your project. And if I had a second year added to it by a biannual, I would be able to take the projects and draw a timeline of people and dollars and make sure that they were spent according to it and hold people accountable to a 2-year increment. This would reduce the risk in a complex IT project because you didn't have to worry about funding every few months, because by the time you get appropriations finished and you get the new authority money, several months in a fiscal year have gone by, you could actually plan about 18 months and be assured of those resources, therefore reducing the risk of just managing a complex IT project and increasing the time at which you could, or not increasing the time, but you could deliver that project a lot faster because you would take out that funding issue, or it would convert the funding issue to an 18-month issue instead of a 9-month issue. And that would be hugely beneficial and a great gift to CIOs and program and project managers around the country.
Thank you. Ms. Coleman, at GSA, you work to develop FedRAMP and streamline agency IT acquisitions in coordination with industry partners. And you now work for one of those industry partners that's trying to help the federal government modernize its systems. What's the impact that the 1-year budgeting and appropriation cycle has on industry and its ability to support IT modernization efforts?
Thank you, Chair. I agree with everything that Renee said about the ability to plan over long time horizons. It's almost even not a 9-month planning horizon with the annual cycle we have now because of the frequency of continuing resolutions, which create even greater uncertainty about available funding and disruption of resources. So that alone is a complication. One thing I'd like to suggest as a companion idea to a 2-year planning and budgeting cycle, which I think is a much needed and helpful measure, is greater use of agile DevOps tactics to break modernization projects into short sprints that deliver short and relatively quick intermediate results so that there can be fine-tuning and transparency and oversight throughout the process. Any project that is intended to deliver results in 2 or 3 years is going to be out of date by the time results are delivered. So we need to be thinking about very short, rapid cycles to deliver results and the accompanying oversight and funding to go with it. Working capital funds of previous legislation have been very helpful. We use that with great success at GSA. We also implemented a zero-based budget so we could see where our incumbent costs were and understand where we needed to place our dollars for modernization priorities.
Thank you. Well, that kind of brings me to another set of questions, and I'm going to start with Mr. Walsh concerning agency modernization plans. Currently, agencies are not required to develop or publish IT modernization plans. While many agencies have developed plans, some of these plans fail to establish concrete timelines, cost estimates, and goals. GAO recognizes that having an IT modernization plan in place is essential to reducing reliance on legacy IT systems. What makes these plans such a valuable tool, and how can agencies better leverage them to meet their goals and manage their resources?
So having these plans is valuable just to get agencies thinking about it. In agencies that don't have a documented plan, we're not sure what kind of resources they're going to be able to throw at it, what kind of timeframes, even the scope of the project. So having some idea of what needs to be done is kind of the most fundamental step. And in our 2019 report, it was very disheartening to see that 3 of the agencies didn't have a plan, an additional 5 had some aspects of a plan, and only 2 really had a firm idea of what needed to be done. So it's critical because modernizing legacy systems is critical to the government's security and privacy and how well we serve our citizens. So getting our agencies to be thinking about modernization is the first step.
Well, thank you for that. One other key element that modernization plans, when they do exist, often omit is how the agency plans to manage costs arising from maintaining a legacy system while they're also implementing a modern system. So let me turn to Mr. Everett now. In your time as a Chief Information Officer at the Department of Energy, how did you manage the competing investment needs between existing systems and new systems? How might agencies leverage modernization plans and existing resources to offset what's essentially the cost of the overlap?
Well, I would tell you much of my experience was, to be very frank, was robbing Peter to pay Paul. In most cases, to do those modernizations, you are going to have to take money from somewhere. I think to Kevin's good point that you've already brought up, without a modernization plan, you can't have the planning. I was frankly somewhat fortunate as a CIO. We had some monies that were multi-year monies that gave some level of help to us in being able to plan. But I know many of my peers had only single-year money, which was a great challenge. So I think your discussion of biannual is certainly helpful. The other one I would bring up certainly is things like TMF and within the MGT Act, the idea of working capital funds. I know that there is long-held concern about working capital funds turning into slush funds and things of that nature. I think that simply means they need to have the appropriate oversight, but they would allow that level of longer-term planning and listen, anybody can put out a modernization plan. But if they don't have the money to back it up or the people to execute on it, it's not going to work anyway. I will also say I think what Ms. Coleman said is absolutely correct. Kevin could probably sit for hours and tell us stories of programs that have been run in the government for multiple years, these large projects, millions if not billions of dollars wasted, that did not ever come to a finish line. Or even worse, came to a finish line, were probably even reported as being on time and schedule, and yet provided no actual value to citizens, to anyone. And so breaking things up, that agile method of breaking things up and doing it in those smaller chunks is appropriate. There are very few systems that we should be building in government anyway. We should mostly be using commercial. And where we do need to build those, and certainly energy, NASA, and other places have those use cases, they should be done in an agile way where you can have some oversight, make sure they're delivering value on an iterative basis, so that you don't have to plunge hundreds of millions of capital expense into something only to come to the end of the road and the money's all gone. I think that's happened far too often. And so it was a challenge again for us. We had a little more flexibility, but even I had to have a lot of conversations. Renee made the right point. You often simply had to build a reserve. And that reserve was usually coming from other things you would have liked to have done that were customer service oriented or those kind of things. And it's a real trap. And it builds what we call technical debt, right? And it's not just the monetary debt. It's all the things we can't do that are a part of that.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for that. And I'm now going to take advantage of a rare moment in the Senate when, because we've got a little bit more time and you guys are such an excellent panel, I have 2 or 3 more questions. So bear with me, but I think we're learning a lot here. And I want to turn now to the issue of the authority of chief information officers. So I want to start with a question to you, Ms. Nguyen. The Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act expanded the responsibilities of agency chief information officers and requires their input on IT acquisitions to realize cost savings and to manage IT inventories. However, despite the good intentions of this law, GAO has found that chief information officers do not receive adequate deference on IT planning, budgeting, and management. Ms. Nguyen, can you speak to your own experiences as a chief information officer, both at the Environmental Protection Agency and at NASA, and how you worked to get institutional buy-in from agency leaders to advance your IT modernization efforts?
Chair Hassan, I would begin by saying never let a crisis go to waste. When it came to exercising the authority and making culture changes and process changes within a federal agency. My first example comes in when I first arrived at NASA and noticed that as Max had earlier said, you need to know who and what is on your network. And that NASA did not have that ability to look at the network associated used across the globe and that's relied upon for the NASA flying assets called satellites. And at that point, we were able to, I could easily go to the leadership and say, how do you know you don't have problems? How do you know you have problems? And so we began the process of rolling out the continuous diagnostic and mitigation program. And with that transparency, we got with that visibility, we got to see what was on our network. And there was a lot of inappropriate software and activity on the network. And then I used that data to share with agency leadership to say, I don't think it's okay for us to be having this type of software on NASA's network. And from there, I would just build with this visibility that we got, tell stories back to folks and turn it around to say, this is not acceptable for a public agency, and use the pride that my colleagues had about working for NASA to really propel us forward. And with each fiscal year, we got better at working as a team by gaining that visibility. And then what we did is when I mentioned the business services assessment and also the follow-on to the business services assessment when NASA said, functional areas such as the CIO needed to have control over the appropriate IT budgets. This was also true for procurement. My colleague in the procurement office recognized that IT needed to be procured better and stood up an IT division while I was still there. And we worked very closely with her to set that up. And the establishment of that IT division meant that all IT purchases for NASA would have to go through that division, and that I or my team had significant influence over that acquisition process. That took about 18 months to get set up. It got going in full swing there after I left NASA. But by having a crisis, by having visibility, and by forming partnerships, NASA was able to continually iterate in order to give the greater authority over to the CIO, gave IT procurement greater visibility into what NASA was buying. And with that visibility and with that partnership, each year that I was there at NASA, we were saving about $50 million a year just on software purchases alone. So real differences can be made through partnership. And I will close with the same thing I started. Never let a good crisis go to waste, and just stand in someone's office, make a friend, and get going on fixing the crisis and changing the processes that might have created that crisis.
Well, thank you for that answer. There's a lot for us to learn from that and from your experience and your good work. Chief information officers spend an average of 2 years or less in their position. So I'm concerned that this short tenure provides very little time for CIOs to be effective or establish fiscally responsible practices. Ms. Coleman, you spent 12 years at the General Services Administration. Do you think that your ability to stay with the agency for that long contributed to your success as a CIO, and how so?
Absolutely. It allowed me to really understand the culture of the agency and, to the point Renee made, to build relationships and partnerships with senior leaders, because modernization is a team sport, and it's important that CIOs have adequate authority, but it's also important that top leadership understand the role that they play in supporting transformation. And to the point you made earlier about the need for modernization plans, it should start at the top and be a priority even of the secretary or the administrator of the agency and the political appointee level. And so by having a long tenure at GSA and in the role of CIO, I was able to understand that and be able to use the tailwinds provided at GSA. It's an agency that provides business services to other agencies, so they take pride in understanding technologies to be a good supplier and partner with other agencies. And that gave us momentum with moving to the cloud, because we were able to tap into the culture of what the agency is good at and the DNA to support it across all lines of authority. And that alignment, not only with leadership, but also with my peer CXOs, the CFO, the head of HR, and so forth, gave us the unity of leadership to make real progress.
Thank you. I'm going to now turn to Mr. Everett, because you had a slightly different experience at Energy, because you had a brief tenure at the Department of Energy, but you were also able to be extremely effective. So what do you recommend that current and future CIOs do to be most effective from their very first day and then forward at an agency?
So I think there's some tremendous challenges on that, and part of this gets into the conversation of political versus career CIOs.
Yep.
That, and there's a trade-off. I absolutely agree the longevity is critical because they can understand the mission. The political ones typically are going to have more access to senior leadership, so there's a bit of a balancing act there. What I would tell you is part of the reason I was being able to be effective is I'd been in federal government before. I knew the ropes. I knew what I was getting into. I routinely tell people, as just sort of a shorthand, it's going to take, if you're new to federal government, it's going to take you a year to know which way is up. If you're coming, no matter how smart you are, private sector, you're going to have to go through a whole year just to know which way is up, all the differences that you have there. And because of the nature of the timing, again, going back to budgets, because of the timing of budget, you're going to go 2 years before you're working with your own budget that you had any input into, right? When I walked in 2017, my initial sort of budget formulation had already been submitted to OMB. By the time that goes clinking around through the entire process of OMB back to the Hill, it was, it's October of, a year and a half later. That's really challenging. I've talked to people from both parties who've been very involved in trying to recruit innovative leaders to come in as CIOs, and you will find ones, they're willing to give up the money. They'll divest their stock. They'll take a salary hit. They'll move their family. They're willing to serve our country, and then they find out, oh, it's going to be 2 years before you can actually make an impact.
Yeah.
That's a killer, because their whole reason of doing such a thing is to make an impact. And when you tell them, and if they're politically appointed, they know they have a shelf life. Yeah. And that's a really hard sale. It's made it really challenging. We have great career folks as well that have done really good jobs as CIOs without question. And so my emphasis is definitely there of giving them more authorities. I would love to get some of those outside CIOs, regardless of political affiliation, because thankfully IT is the last nonpartisan issue in town. And so I'd love to have those people. I'd love to have those innovators. But we do have to have the structure so that they feel it's worth the sacrifice to come in and bring that experience and the innovation that they have from the private sector. It's critical. And in the meantime, we got plenty of great career CIOs and deputy CIOs out there. And so giving them the tools, FITARA is an important tool, but you have to know how to use it, right? Yep. You can't, I've been at probably the three most spread out agencies. I was DOE, I spent time at Commerce and at DHS. I would describe them at best as a feudal system, if not a mob family. And you have to be able to pick your fights. And I've seen CIOs who got run over because they didn't use FATARA appropriately. Renee made a great point. Procurement was a great ally to me in the process. So I would tell people walking in, your procurement officer is going to be a great help. I will pick a fight and say, we need more support versus the CFOs. CFOs typically are Senate confirmed.
Yeah.
Only one CIO, VA, is Senate confirmed. And just in the pecking order of this town, it is very difficult for CIOs going up against a Senate confirmed CFO, and that's you can make a great relationship with them, but at the end of the day, they're higher on that pecking order, and that's a challenge for many CIOs because you're not sort of quite at the same level, and that's a challenge.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to turn to one other topic before I ask you a wrap-up question, and it's something all of you have mentioned, but I just want to focus in on it a little bit. So I want to start again with Mr. Everett. As part of the American Rescue Plan, the Technology Modernization Fund received $1 billion to loan to agencies in order to modernize IT systems. Although we don't see the impact of these funds for years to come, this is a really major step forward to reduce reliance on legacy IT, and I hope that the fund prioritizes agency plans to replace the legacy IT systems that we've discussed today. So, Mr. Everett, as a CIO who successfully leveraged the Technology Modernization Fund to move away from legacy IT systems, how should agencies utilize the fund to ensure that they not only have the resources and infrastructure to support IT modernization, but also ensure that the systems they propose actually reduce reliance on legacy IT while contributing to better security and customer service?
The first thing they should do is have the courage to actually go apply for those. And I think if you go look, I believe it's still only 5 agencies have actually received TMF loans. And I spent a lot of time browbeating people, and I know of people who were simply afraid of the oversight, afraid of the visibility. And they were also afraid of the repayment, which is why I think that has to be looked at. But a lot of them, listen, from my team, the culture change was important. I had members of my team, my career team, come back and tell me they enjoyed the process. They went through a process that's similar to anybody who's ever worked in private sector. You can go right now to the website, the TMF website, and go through the spreadsheets and see the level of detail that you were asked about your current cost basis and your future cost basis. That's how everybody in the private sector runs their IT. That's exactly how we should. We should know all of our costs across the board. We should be able to project them out over years. That's what any mature organization would do. And that's a huge value of the TMF. And you need your people to do that. And so literally, I don't care if you don't turn it in, everyone should go do one of those today. Everybody in government. So I think part of it is being brave enough to step forward and go ahead and do it. Know that there's going to be that challenge. There is oversight to it. The board checks in on you, so you don't just get a giant check. There is a process to it, and that's critically important. I would urge all of you, I've been in this town 20 years, when Congress gave $1 billion to a program that most people kind of don't understand, I know for a fact in this town there are people eyeballing that money who want to cut the line and avoid the process. And I would strongly urge you to make sure that your oversight does not allow that to happen. That process has to be followed. Now, it can go to all sorts of things. And so to your point, those legacy systems are probably, arguably, the easiest ones to show in many cases where you can get value and return on the investment. And they're great, but I will also mention, and this is where some of those waivers need to be looked at, there are so many customer-facing systems, it's very hard to document the cost savings there. The customer service we can talk about all day long. You can see with your eyes, but it may be harder to show the cost savings on that system. And that's where I think we do need to look at some ability to defer or waive costs as long as the process is followed. TMF, I'm such a proponent, as you can tell, of TMF, because that process leads us to how we should manage things. It should not simply be giving things out to a most favored program.
Right.
We've done that too often, and that's a disaster. Making people go through the process is just so critical. And I think any CIO coming in right now, it's a great test of your team. Ask them to go find you. I would challenge any new CIO. Tell your team to find one program or system that needs to be modernized and make them fill the form out and take a look at it. And you should be able to tell right there, do they know their costs? Do they know their systems? Do they understand how to project that budget? And if they don't, get help. There's some great groups in town some truly private sector associations that will come in free of charge and come help you with your acquisition and your budget process, and they're not trying to sell you anything.
Yeah.
As well as Kevin mentioned TBM, another great process you can go through to understand in a very modern way how your costs should be managed. There's help out there for anybody who's looking for it in federal government right now if they're willing to reach out.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to turn to Ms. Coleman, too, about working capital funds. I just will also note that one of the issues you raise is how we go about qualifying and quantifying customer service value, right? Because obviously for taxpayers, our goal should be to make the interface with the federal government as customer-friendly as possible, since taxpayers are footing the bill here. And so trying to figure out a way to really assess value there, I think, is really important. Ms. Coleman, working capital funds are another mechanism that agencies can use to support their IT modernization priorities outside of the one-year budgeting and appropriation cycle. While some agencies have the authority to establish these funds under the Modernizing Government Technology Act, some agencies weren't given the authority, which is a technical error that I hope to address in future legislation. But Ms. Coleman, the General Services Administration effectively uses working capital funds and fees generated from its government-wide services to fund its mission. Can you describe how GSA uses savings produced from modernization projects to keep the working capital fund going?
Yes, thank you. One of the keys is to take a portfolio approach, and I completely agree with what Max said earlier about the working capital funds. And modernization of any system by itself, viewed in isolation, is going to be it's going to incur cost and complexity. One way to counterbalance that is to look across all systems and all investments, and to be able to do puts and takes in a portfolio-based approach. And if you have a working capital fund, you can apply know your money, and you can time the modernization according to your risk management and according to your most critical systems first, or the ones that deliver the greatest impact. And so as it pertains to customer service, that is a qualitative measure, not so much a quantitative measure, but the ability to stay up to date with platforms that are maintained by the vendor rather than having to continually to invest with agency resources for these big upgrades every 2 or 3 years provides cost savings along the way as well.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh, from GAO's perspective, what are the advantages or disadvantages of relying on the Technology Modernization Fund or working capital funds to resource IT modernization rather than requesting funding through the annual budget requests?
So, as the other witnesses have noted, the TMF allows agencies to kind of shortcut the budget cycle. Now, it is still a loan. It's not just a free gift to go out and spend willy-nilly. That it has to be, you go through the application process. And I'll also note that the process as described, going through TMF that Max talked about, is very similar to having the modernization plans that we describe. You got to have some idea of the work to be done, the timelines, and a plan to turn off the old system. The disadvantage to the TMF is that it is linked to spending and cost savings.
Right.
There are times where we need to modernize systems, and they will not save money. The OPM breach that we talked about earlier, the government had the choice to modernize those networks and systems to allow the data to be encrypted when it was at rest. It was a trade-off. I'm sure if OPM wanted to go back in time and had that decision to make, they would absolutely spend the money to modernize that. But they wouldn't save any money by doing that modernization. So modernization is not just about cost savings. It's about better services to our citizens, privacy, security. Cost savings can be a part of it, but there's a lot more to this decision than just the money.
Well, thank you. Look, that concludes the rounds of questions I had. I'm going to ask you all one wrap-up question and just double-check with staff. We're good on other senators, right? Okay. So first of all 4 of you have been so generous, not only with your time this morning and your preparation for this hearing, but with your expertise and your clear engagement with this issue and desire to help the federal government do its work much better and modernize in the IT sector at a time when we so desperately need to do that, for all the reasons I think, among others, that the pandemic has really laid clear. So thank you for your service, for your expertise, and for your testimony today. As we wrap up, I'm going to ask each of you this, and I'll start with Ms. Nguyen. Could each of you describe what, in your opinion, is the greatest challenge presented by the sustained use of legacy IT systems? If you already feel like you've talked about it, just go ahead and say that, but I really don't want to let this opportunity go without just giving you all a chance to focus on that. And Ms. Nguyen, we'll start with you.
Great, thank you. And thank you again for the honor to testify today. It's a great pleasure of mine to continue to give to the United States federal government after 30 years of service. So I would say the greatest challenge presented to us today are agency and department cultures. They must recognize that IT modernization is part of the path forward for the United States government to quickly and securely deliver new or better quality services to the American public. And this needs to be done with a positive customer experience. And finally, it must be delivered in a way that improves national security and not poke a hole through it. Again, it was an honor to be here and to be with my former colleagues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nguyen. Mr. Everett.
I would say, I hope that we've covered it well for you. I think I would summarize it simply saying missed opportunities. To me, this challenge is we're missing opportunities across the board, opportunities to secure our systems, opportunities to entice people with new and innovative skills into government, opportunities to serve the citizens of the country. All of those are sort of these missed opportunities over and over again that we're just stuck in these systems, right? And again, that's that word I use, technical debt, but that's what it means is it's not just the money. It's as Renee said, it's the culture. It's so many of these things that we're missing out on, these missed opportunities that we could get simply by doing some basic modernization of systems. The flow down effect would be really, I think, dramatic in just so many different areas. And so that's the part that disappoints me. But right now, it also excites me because we've got new resources. We've got the attention of Congress and other folks. We've got some really good new opportunities right now. And everyone has seen the value that IT can bring to life and to meeting challenges just after this last year of dealing with COVID. There's so many things we're able to do because of technology. I think there's a unique time of recognition of that. And so I would love to see that progress not pause, but accelerate in 2021.
Thank you. Ms. Coleman?
Chair Hassan, I think it's a mark of how aligned we all are that when you asked this question, I wrote down culture change and missed opportunities, just like Renee and Max. And I think that just to double down on that statement, modern technology allows us to do things not just better, but things we couldn't do before.
Right.
And I think that's the missed opportunity if we don't modernize. And I'll give you one very quick example. The pandemic has illustrated so many areas where government is so critical to the well-being of the public. In New Mexico, unemployment claims spiked by 600% when people were thrust out of work and call center workers were sent home, and they weren't able to process claims in a timely way. We had the opportunity to help them with a virtual contact center, which allowed their workers to work from home, but also with chatbots that let them answer questions in an automated fashion and take some of that burden off of the call center agents to focus on the higher value need and get economic relief into the community quickly. So there are things that can be done that we're just not taking advantage of at every level of government. And I think that the time is now to rethink that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Walsh?
It's hard to imagine a government function that isn't somehow tied to IT. Right. As we go along, IT has become more and more complex. If you look back again to the Voyager probes, those were written with 3,000 lines of COBOL code. We've come a long way since then. Modern technology requires millions, if not billions, of lines of code. The problem is, the longer we wait to modernize, the longer we procrastinate, the more it's going to cost, both in terms of money, in terms of breaches, in terms of security, in terms of lost, to quote my peers, lost opportunities, ways that we could have better served our citizens. So it's an issue of procrastination. We need to act. We need to act now.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all four of you for your time and your testimony this afternoon. To Kevin Walsh, Casey Coleman, Renee Wynn, and Max Everett, your testimony provided really valuable insights on this topic, and your contributions to improving federal IT systems in a fiscally responsible way are just really, really appreciated. As I mentioned in my opening statement, this hearing is just the first on the costs and challenges presented by reliance on legacy IT systems, and I look forward to continuing this important oversight work to save taxpayer dollars, to deliver government services more efficiently, and to keep government IT systems secure. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on May 12th for submissions of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.